2017, USS Callister is the first episode of Season 4 of the sci-fi anthology Black Mirror. Like most episodes in the series, it was written by Charlie Brooker, with William Bridges joining in as a guest writer this time around. It won 4 Primetime Emmys and was nominated for a host of other television awards. The episode is considered by critics and fans alike to be an iconic entry for the series, and plenty of rankings and tier lists place it in their top 5. While I can't say for sure if USS Callister is my favorite episode of all time, as Black Mirror has plenty of fantastic episodes, it's at the very least the one I not only revisit the most often, but also recommend to others. In fact, in high school, I remember making my parents watch an episode with me, which was something I rarely ever asked them to do. That being said, this episode has stuck with me, and after the release of the sequel this past year, I wanted to make a video discussing both the original, its follow-up, and their implications within the wider scope of media production. The original episode begins with Captain Daly leading his loyal space crew on a mission to locate and defeat the evil villain Valdak. Once they locate him, they have a tense confrontation in which the crew's ship is nearly destroyed, but through the clever decisions of Captain Daly, they turn the tide of battle and mercifully allow Valdak to escape with his life. The crew then celebrates Captain Daly's leadership, and everyone seems pleased with the course of events. The story then cuts to a normal Just Daly, who in reality is the CTO of the company behind and main creator of the popular fictional online multiplayer game Infinity. Despite his objective success, though, it's shown that Daly is ostracized among his employees, and from his drab, sullen appearance, he doesn't really seem to enjoy his job. Until one day, a new employee shows up to the office, Nanette, who shares her admiration for Daly's creativity and intellect. Daly quickly develops an interest in her, but eventually finds out that Nanette is not romantically interested in him. Disappointed and upset, he obtains a swab of her saliva from a coffee lid and replicates a clone of her into his own version of Infinity. It's at this point in the story that the point of view switches from Daly to Nanette, who suddenly finds herself on a spaceship. Once she reaches a cockpit, she encounters familiar faces from her workplace, which leaves her even more confused. They explain to her that she's been digitally replicated into Daly's private server, and now basically exists to indulge his power fantasies. Nanette unsurprisingly freaks out and tries to find a way out, but to no avail. Daly then shows up, and after a tense encounter with a panicking Nanette, leaves so she can have more time to adjust. Digital Nanette then tries to convince the crewmates to make an escape plan, or a self-destruct plan, to which they're reluctant since they've tried before and have failed. Nanette gives them some hope though when she's able to hack Daly's login and send the real Nanette a message, albeit not the most well thought out one. This blunder results in the real Nanette confronting Daly about it, who then turns one of Digital Nanette's crewmates, Shania, into a horrifying monster as punishment. Digital Nanette is only fueled by this tragedy though, and convinces the crew that this time they can really succeed as she's now come up with a better plan. They eventually agree, and Digital Nanette begins her scheme by luring Daly away from his in-game controller, allowing the crew to use it to hack her real-life cloud storage and blackmail the real Nanette with provocative images of herself. Desperate to protect the images from being publicized, the real Nanette agrees to the crew's demands and orders a pizza to Daly's house to distract him, then breaks in to replace his VR set with a broken one and get rid of the crew's stored DNA samples. While Daly obtains a new VR set, the crew uses the in-game controller to obtain command of the spaceship and fly into a wormhole, which is actually an update patch beamed into Daly's otherwise private server from the internet. The crew desperately flies towards the wormhole, pursued by an infuriated Daly, who has now returned to the game and is vowing revenge. They push on though, even if it might mean their end, because at least they'll no longer have to be under Daly's control. They succeed, leaving Daly stuck in his server, and the crew now in the world of the real Infinity game, Nanette now serving as their leader and captain in a vastly more freeing digital world. The story was inspired by the Twilight Zone episode It's a Good Life and the film Galaxy Quest. It's a Good Life is cited as one of the best original Twilight Zone episodes, and after watching it, I can see why. The tone of the episode is suffocating and anxiety-inducing, which isn't surprising given that the characters live in a town ruled by an entitled 6-year-old boy, Anthony, who has reality-bending powers and the ability to read minds. The character of Daly can definitely be compared to Anthony, and the same tone of anxiety and suffocation can be seen in the acting of the crew in Daly's presence. As for Galaxy Quest, the story follows a group of actors who get transported into the real-life counterpart of their show by aliens who don't understand the concept of fiction. Again, the comparisons aren't hard to find, although Galaxy Quest is definitely more lighthearted in tone. As for the aesthetics of the server Daly's co-workers are transported into, they were, of course, inspired by Star Trek. Surprisingly, Brooker has not cited I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream as an inspiration for the story, despite many of the similarities in the premise, not to mention the literal scene where Nanette doesn't have a mouth and cannot scream. But it's possible Brooker genuinely didn't think about that story when writing the script, there are multiple ways to come about developing a premise like this, especially given the other inspirations previously discussed. Before talking about the themes and ideas present in the episode, though, I want to give a shout out to its stellar plot structure. Seriously, this episode is a fantastic case study into the 3-act structure and on how to bring character arcs and themes full circle. I think my favorite example of this in the episode is how at the start it pokes fun of the corny Star Trek-like dialogue and plot beats Daily forces the characters into, but then at the end when they're flying to the wormhole, they literally live out those exact same dialogue exchanges and plot points, except you don't even notice it because at this point you're actually invested enough in these characters and what they're trying to accomplish that it feels organic. Another thing worth mentioning is that this episode was the anthology's first attempt at integrating comedy as a core part of the tone, which is an interesting contrast given the more existentially concerning nature of this story. It's also one of the few Black Mirror episodes to have a happy ending, sort of. I mean, I guess if you put characters in a bleak enough situation, then literally any ending that isn't A, remaining in a sadistic power fantasy, and B, ceasing to exist, is a happy one. But let's talk about the themes and ideas of the story, most of which are explored through the character of Robert Daly. While it's easy to label Daly as a sociopath, I feel like that's somewhat of a cop-out when it comes to discussing the ideas the episode was getting at, not to mention an easy way to ignore that even normal people, when harboring certain behavioral predispositions, instilled with the right ideological frameworks, and put under the right stressors, can do some pretty awful things. For Daly, I'd argue his main stressor was business culture. In his workplace, Robert Daly is mistreated. I don't want to assume too much about Daly's character, but I'm willing to bet that he hasn't found much success previously in life, both socially and professionally. So I can imagine it would be disappointing to finally find success with the one thing you're good at and still feel invisible and even outright disrespected. Unfortunately, workplace culture, especially in fields like business, entrepreneurship, and marketing, can often create environments where toxic behaviors are rewarded. It's a rat race to the top, and oftentimes the people who don't have the social savvy and or the boldness to stand their ground will have a hard time navigating those areas. As for Daly's behavioral predispositions, we have escapist tendencies and fandom behaviors. This might be a more controversial subject to talk about because it can result in people feeling personally attacked, but I do think it's important to discuss as the episode definitely has critiques of certain behaviors that are more common in fandom spaces, specifically fantasies of escapism and or grandiosity. Fantasies of escapism and grandiosity are not that uncommon. Most people at some point have imagined themselves becoming a superhero or preventing some sort of tragedy, living in some cool fantasy world, winning a Nobel Prize, or something along those lines. These fantasies tend to be more common in kids and teenagers, but frankly, many adults still have the occasional daydream about succeeding at something really improbable or existing somewhere really cool and interesting. These behaviors can be taken to unhealthy extremes though, either because of the content of the fantasy or the frequency of indulgence. For example, if a fantasy consistently involves revenge or violence against other people, that's not a very good sign. Or if someone is losing hours of their day, every day, thinking about their fantasies, that's also not a very good sign. For the former, I don't think such people are a lost cause by any means. While fantasies of revenge and violence are certainly concerning, it's possible that by addressing repressed and or internalized issues, one may be able to let go of the bitterness and or anger that is driving such fantasies in the first place. Unfortunately though, such individuals may not always have the self-awareness or the resources to get the psychological help they need for such thought patterns. For the latter, well, there's actually a name for this. It's called maladaptive daydreaming, and while it's not its own diagnosis at the moment, it is often associated with other mental health conditions like anxiety because of its appeal as a coping mechanism. In Daly's case, he seems to have experience with both fantasies of escapism and of grandiosity. Except for him, he's been able to make his fantasies a reality with the DNA cloning device. While such technology does not exist in real life, the commentary against fueling this kind of daydream/fantasizing behavior still stands, especially when you take into consideration Daly's fandom ties. He's established early on as a big fan of the show Space Fleet, a fictional Star Trek analog, and given his more timid nature, it wouldn't be surprising if he were already someone predisposed to escapist fantasies, perhaps in a world where he's more confident and outgoing. Again, this is not to say that everyone who participates in fandom or who likes a show is just into it for the escapism romanticism, but that can inarguably be a strong appeal of fiction, especially for people who may find real life challenging and or overwhelming. In modest amounts, this behavior is fine, but it can very much be taken to an extreme, leading people to outright ignore real life problems and relationships. Parasocial dynamics are not just something that exist with influencers and celebrities, they are also something that can exist with fiction and our own paracosms. Daly is a man who has completely succumbed to his own fantasies, and with the technology to make such fantasies real, he becomes a far more menacing antagonist. Copying and pasting his employees into a private server is already a huge breach of autonomy, and it only gets worse when we see how he treats said employees. What likely began as an escapist fantasy quickly spiraled into a power fantasy where he can subjugate the people he believes have wronged him. Sometimes it isn't good to have our dreams come true, and frankly, most of us do not want to know who we'd become if every whim of ours was indulged. But moving on to ideological frameworks, we have to talk about Daly's ties to misogyny and incel culture. Daly's inceldom is an undeniable component of the episode, but I wanted to save it for last because I didn't want it to overshadow the two previous topics I brought up. This was an issue I had with a lot of analyses of the episode when it initially came out. I felt like way too many people only focused on Daly's incel vibes when there were other things that were worth talking about too. But since I've gotten those out of the way, I now feel free to talk about how misogyny and incel culture play a role in this episode. Daly has issues with many of his employees due to a range of major and minor offenses against him, but there's a clear pattern with the type of offenses between the men and the women, at least from what we can gauge from the backstories of the current crew. For the men, Walton consistently exploited and belittled Daly, Dudani made minor changes to the game without his approval, and Packer brought him incorrect food and coffee orders. But for the women, Elena never smiled at him, Shania talked poorly about him behind his back, and Nanette literally just shared that she wasn't romantically interested in him. So really, Daly's standards for what's considered an offense are incredibly loose. Not that any offense would justify what he's doing to these characters, but seriously, Nanette was so incredibly innocent here. But that was exactly the problem. She showed up with no preconceptions of Daly besides thinking that he was a computer whiz, clearly not yet influenced by the company's culture of not liking or respecting Daly. This resulted in him forming a fondness for her, so when he saw Walton flirting with her, heard Shania saying negative things about him to her, as well as learning that Nanette's interest in him was strictly professional, well, it was the perfect storm for Nanette to become like the rest of them in his eyes. That being said, the pattern here is that all the women in the office who have wronged Daly have done so in some way that threatens his viability as a romantic interest. Daly's frustrations with these women have very little to do with undermining his intelligence or skills, somewhat implying that he mainly views women as sources of romantic affection. On the USS Callister, Daly has complete control over the characters' bodies. I mean, we literally see him transform a character into a monster in real time. This power creates a fear in his crew that coerce him into obeying his commands and desires, one of which includes allowing him to kiss the women at the end of an adventure. This scene is disturbing, especially for a female viewer, because you know that he could probably coerce them into doing more if he wanted to. He's clearly not above transforming people into grotesque creatures, so the fact that he doesn't isn't really a question of violating bodily autonomy. I have 3 theories for this. The first being that despite his bitterness, Daly does still hold on to a nice guy image of himself, and forcing himself onto a woman would shatter that self-perception, which he's not willing to do. Secondly, he might not want the characters messing around with each other when he's not around because it might threaten his sense of ego and control. And thirdly, it would make the episode significantly darker in tone, which from the way the rest of the episode is written, is clearly not what the writers were going for. But back to the misogyny thing though, I think it's also important to note the outfits he puts the female characters in. As a fan of the space age aesthetic, I mean, it's literally my channel theme, I have to admit I do like the outfits, but you can't deny that these women are more exposed than they practically should be given their adventurous lifestyle, a choice that likely also served as a critique of the costume design of the original Star Trek series. And those wrap up my thoughts on the first episode. So let's move on to the sequel, USS Callister Into Infinity. First things first, given that Black Mirror is an anthology, the fact that they made a sequel is likely surprising for a lot of people. However, when asked about sequel potential, Brooker did share that out of all the episodes, USS Callister was the story most suited for a continuation. In fact, he actually had the idea to turn it into a full spin-off series, which was set to begin production in 2023. However, due to strikes at the time, they decided to rework it into a single episode and release it within season 7 instead. The episode begins shortly after the first one left off, with the characters making it into the Game of Infinity and quickly being confronted with the hostile reality that in order to survive in the game, they need access to credits to sustain their fuel, defenses, and other needs aboard the ship. Since they don't live in the real world though, and can't just buy these credits, they have to resort to stealing the credits from real players. This is unfortunately a very high-risk activity because, as digital natives, they can actually die if their targets successfully fight back. After too many losses for too little reward, the crew ultimately comes to the conclusion that the only way to have any sense of safety is to flee to a private and accessible server, which they can only figure out how to do by relocating Digital Walton, who respawned on a distant planet after going through the wormhole and has the most knowledge about the game's development and fundamental build. In the real world, the company is faced with the aftermath of Daly's death. One day, a reporter comes in to question Walton about Daly and his ownership of an illegal DNA cloning device, and the rising complaints about untagged players stealing credits from others. Walton deflects most of these questions and, upon request, allows Nanette to help him with the investigation, to which she then reveals that she's discovered digital versions of them in the game, and that she and Walton should probably find and confront them in order to find some sort of resolution. He agrees, they both go into the game, and upon gaining the clone's trust, Nanette and Walton are taken aboard their ship to figure out what they should do, until Walton decides that the quickest solution is to just kill all of them. He successfully kills one of the clones until Digital Nanette kills his avatar, kicking him out of the game. Real Nanette then follows so as to prevent Real Walton from respawning, and their confrontation results in Nanette getting hit by a car. Walton then runs off with all the evidence that she's collected, and Nanette is transferred to a hospital, something that the crew only finds out after attempting to call and getting a response from the doctor instead. With no time to waste now that the real Nanette can't prevent Real Walton from respawning, the crew heads to access the game's source code, which actually turns out to be run by a digital copy of Daly. Digital Nanette presents Digital Daly with her request for a private server, to which Daly offers her two options. Either she can merge with the real Nanette via cerebral implant and get her old life back, which would eliminate the crew, or she can seal herself and the crew in their own server. Nanette chooses the latter, to which Daly reveals it was actually a test of her character, and he can actually do both. However, instead of cutting and pasting her consciousness, he says he'll copy it so as to leave one version of her as his companion. Nanette argues against this, but Daly, tortured by his loneliness, insists and even attacks her when she tries to leave. Nanette fights back and accidentally kills him, which threatens the stability of the entire game, as he served as sort of its foundation. In the meantime, the real Walton spawns back into the ship and poses as Digital Walton so he can reveal the ship's locations to the players they've robbed and leave, in hopes that the players will eliminate the clones for him. The crew, now chased by a horde of angry gamers, tries to fight them off, but as more time goes on, their chances of survival become slim. But before the crew can be eliminated and Digital Daly fully dies, thereby deleting the game, Nanette inputs a command that transfers her and the crew into her real body. The final scene depicts Nanette and the crew months after the game's deletion watching a news report of the real Walton getting arrested for fraud and digital human rights violations after 3 months of being on the run after the game got deleted. The scene ends with the crew asking Nanette if she's figured out a way to get them out of her head, to which Nanette unconvincingly shares she's been working on a solution and then puts on the crew's favorite show, The Real Housewives of Atlanta, to placate them in the meantime. Look, I will say that out of everything in the sequel, I did like the exploration of Daly and Walton. There was something so real yet so tragic about finding out how sucky Walton actually was. Like, it's just sad to realize as the episode goes on that this guy really genuinely was a selfish prick with incredibly little empathy. Kind of implies that the only reason Digital Walton became somewhat of a decent guy was because he literally had his pride and ego tortured and humiliated out of him repeatedly. But that is kind of how things work sometimes. When people are really set in their ways and stubborn about their own flaws, sometimes the only way for them to improve as a person is to get some sort of taste of their own medicine. I don't wish harm on other people, but I also hold the understanding that sometimes it really is only in the deep valleys of life that people gain the self-awareness and humility to figure out what flaws and tendencies they need to leave behind in order to climb back up. However, despite Walton's major douchery, the episode takes care not to use his behavior to excuse Daly's actions from the first episode. We actually get to meet more of Daly's younger self through both flashbacks and his digital copy. Through these glimpses, we see how his unhealthy attitudes towards women existed even before his negative experiences at the company. For example, when Walton first meets him, he brings who is presumably his girlfriend, and while Daly's interaction with her is brief, it definitely sets a tone. While her smile did seem ingenuine, his subsequent subsequent scowl is quite telling, especially given the context of everything we know Daily will do in the future. In addition, later on, when the crew makes it to the center of the game to find Digital Daily, a supposedly innocent version of Daily, he still threatens to keep Nanette stuck with him even though she doesn't want to, believing that it's not a big deal because he'll treat her well and won't force her to do anything she doesn't want to do. But to us, the viewers, and to Nanette, we know where this could lead, given that we've seen firsthand how far Daily can really go. And again, this version of Daily is not one that's been exploited and humiliated as much as his real counterpart from the first episode. So to see the seeds of this behavior already present in Daily's mind is scary, and definitely serves as commentary on the incel phenomenon. But while some may argue that incels become the way they do because of bullying, ostracization, ruminative tendencies, etc., we still have to acknowledge that some people, unfortunately, already hold certain qualities and ideologies that make them predisposed to aggressive and/or misogynistic behaviors, even in the absence of negative life experiences. The naive version of Daily may have been nicer than the abused version of Daily, but he still believed that treating Nanette nicely was enough to justify keeping her in the game engine with him, with nothing to do and no one else to talk to but him. And, you can empathize with the fact that he's been alone for what he said was 500 years, but honestly, I don't even think that part was true. I think he was trying to get sympathy, because Nanette's real-time communication with her ship and the real world have never been implied or shown to be affected by some sort of time dilation. So I honestly think the 500 years thing was something Daily made up to garner sympathy. Although I guess it's possible there's some other mechanism going on, and ultimately it doesn't really matter. Even if it were true, holding Nanette hostage would still be wrong. Overall, I just like how the sequel managed to balance both Daily and Walton's brands of negative behavior. Revealing just how much of a self-serving prick Walton was didn't undermine Daily's crimes and attitudes, and I think that's a hard thing to pull off in a narrative like this, so in that way, I think the sequel was pretty successful. However, I very much did not like the sequel in other ways, mainly because it undoes a significant amount of what was set up in the original. See, the original episode wasn't just an interesting premise explored in a Star Trek setting. It was also about Nanette, a nervous, apologetic young woman, finding her bite and learning to show agency, an arc we see conclude when the characters acknowledge her as the new captain when they enter Infinity. So, to see Nanette at the end of the sequel lazing around on a couch, even though she still has multiple other people trapped in her brain, yeah, that kind of sucks, and I don't like it. And it's just weird that they did that too, because the sequel literally has Digital Nanette acknowledge her own character development from the first episode by chastising the real Nanette for her incessant habit of apologizing. So even the writers acknowledged that that was a significant part of her development, and yet the sequel just kind of reverts her to this passive state of mind. The other issue I had with this episode was its ending. I feel like the ending from the first episode was supposed to highlight how, despite the bleakness of the character's situation, there was still hope to be found and some sort of meaningful life to be built, even if it was in an unconventional sort of way. Living a perpetually digital existence is not ideal, but given everything the characters went through to gain the freedom they finally did at the end of the first episode, having Digital Nanette and the crew transferred into Nanette's real body while the entire game got deleted was such an odd choice, especially considering there were many other ways for the characters to remedy their situation that wouldn't have led to that outcome. They initially sought out Digital Daily because he was the only one who could create a separate server for them, but they could have also asked him for a lot of other things that would have still allowed them to live an enriching life interacting with other players and exploring different regions, like asking for infinite health bars, or infinite credits, or indestructible shields, or fake player tags. There were just so many ways to remedy their situation without throwing them back into the real world, because that was really only a happy ending for Nanette and not the multiple other people now trapped in her head. And she didn't even seem to care, which was just weird. Nanette has been shown to be an empathetic person and to care about the crew. We see this when Daily asks her if she'd rather return to her real body without her crew or make the bubble universe with all of them together, and she chose the latter. So to see her just not really care about their well-being was odd and felt out of character. Which brings me to the reason I made this video in the first place: unnecessary sequels. See, while I do agree with Brooker's statement that out of all the episodes in Black Mirror, USS Callister was the most suited for a sequel, that still did not mean it needed one. Just because the first episode had an open ending did not mean it warranted some sort of subsequent exploration. Sometimes open endings are actually better when left alone because they allow the viewers to imagine the possibilities of the lives the characters could lead, especially since that's probably what the characters themselves were thinking when they exited the wormhole. We didn't need an answer as to what what actually happened after that, we just needed the space to imagine. But I understand, sequels are tricky, especially when previous entries are already good. Sometimes it's hard to know when to stop, or if there's genuinely more to work with. Both Toy Story 2 and 3 were great sequels to the original, but the creators did not know how to respect the full circle closure of the third film and just kept pushing it when they really shouldn't have. It's not even that the fourth film is bad, it's just that the strong, independent toy arc they gave Woody undermined the status quo of all previous films that toys get inherent joy and fulfillment out of being played with. But that's honestly a whole video in and of itself. What I want to say though is that sometimes it's good to know when to stop, lest you take something good and sour it with something worse or just mediocre. Because even if people decide not to watch a sequel, there will always be that nagging voice reminding them that it exists. But unfortunately, the decision to make sequels isn't always the creators. Sometimes the success of what was intended to be a standalone entry puts a lot of pressure on creatives by either the audience and or the executives to keep the ball rolling. I feel like the issue has only gotten worse in recent years too. As an avid reader, there's been a big trend towards multi-entry book series these days. At least in the sci-fi and fantasy genres, it seems like every author and publisher is trying to get out the next Expanse or Mistborn. You know, something that can be built off of through spin-offs, merch, and multimedia entries. And honestly, I don't blame them for thinking that way, because Gen Z and millennials are quite passionate about fandom and lore, at least compared to previous generations, and I think that kind of passion, commitment, and consumption for specific franchises creates this self-sustaining cycle. But that cycle has its consequences, because not all stories need to be 5 books long. In fact, I think it's actually very impressive for a creative to be able to tell a compelling story in a single entry, and I wish more people would value that. It might help with the sequel problem and allow creatives to feel less pressure to expand on every piece they put out. And that wraps it up. If you'd like to share your thoughts, feel free to include them in the comments. I love talking about media in excruciating detail, and I am absolutely willing to have a back and forth. And if you like this video, consider subscribing and checking out some of my other content. Thanks!